All right, welcome. Today we're digging into a fascinating and maybe even controversial idea from a source article. It argues that a lot of religious practices we see today didn't start where we think they did, but actually have a direct line all the way back to ancient Babylon.
So the whole thing kicks off with this really big question, right? It kind of stops you in your tracks. Are some Christian traditions not actually biblical? The author uses this as a jumping-off point to look at the origins of everything, symbols, rituals, even titles. So how do they connect the dots? Well, let's dive in and see.
Okay, so here's how we're going to walk through the author's argument. It's broken down into 6 main parts. We'll start with this idea of 2 opposing spiritual systems. From there, we'll follow the trail of one big idea, starting with what the source calls the blueprint in Babylon, see how it spread, and then look at a huge turning point in Rome that supposedly brought it all into the early church.
All right, first up, the author wants us to see history in a new light. It's not just a timeline of events. Instead, they frame it as this epic, ongoing struggle between 2 systems. On one side, the worship of God as laid out in the Bible, and on the other, something the author calls a counterfeit system.
Now, this next point is absolutely crucial to understanding the whole argument. The source is saying we shouldn't think of different pagan religions as separate things. Instead, think of them as one single system, a system of rebellion that's a master of disguise. It just changes its clothes, you know? It might look different in Babylon versus Egypt or Rome, but the author argues its spiritual DNA, its core essence, stays exactly the same.
Yeah, this quote right here, it's basically the entire argument in a nutshell. What starts in one place, Babel, just keeps echoing through history. It weaves its way through pagan cultures, even gets into ancient Israel, and then pops up again later, just with a Christian label on it. So that begs the question, right? Where did it all begin? Well, according to the article, we have to go back to Babylon.
And here we are. The author pinpoints the very beginning of this organized rebellion to the time right after the Great Flood, in Babylon. And it all centers around one specific person mentioned in Genesis, a man named Nimrod.
So the author presents this as a kind of 3-act story for Nimrod. First, he builds his kingdom at Babel. Then he leads this big rebellion against God's plan. But here's the twist. The argument is that this wasn't just political. After Nimrod died, the source claims that rebellion morphed into a religion. He was supposedly deified, worshipped as the sun god, and the whole system put humanity, not God, at the very center of everything.
Okay, so the story doesn't end with Nimrod. The author brings in 2 more key players, who they say complete this new religious framework: his wife, Semiramis, and their son, Tammuz. And it's these 3 together that the article calls the original counterfeit trinity.
So look at how the author breaks this down. It's really interesting. You've got Nimrod, the father figure, who becomes the sun god. Then there's Semiramis, the mother, who's the moon goddess. And finally, Tammuz, the son, who is said to be Nimrod reincarnated. The source calls this whole setup the first counterfeit trinity, a structure designed, they argue, to look a lot like the real thing, but to ultimately pull people away from it.
Now, to back this up, the author points straight to the Bible, to the book of Ezekiel. And this is a huge point in their argument. They're saying, look, this wasn't just some weird practice happening way out in Babylon. This verse shows it happening right at the gates of God's own temple in Jerusalem. The prophet sees women weeping for Tammuz, and in the text, God calls it an abomination. It had infiltrated, so to speak.
Okay, so once this system is established, the article then follows the trail of that mother goddess figure, Semiramis. It tracks how her worship supposedly didn't stay in Babylon, but began to spread far and wide.
And this goes back to that idea of a system in disguise. The author argues that as this idea spread, her name changed depending on where you were. Semiramis in Babylon became Ishtar, then Astarte, then Ashtaroth. But, and this is the key, the core figure was the same, a powerful mother goddess, often called the Queen of Heaven. The claim is that the same essential character was worshipped all over the ancient world.
And again, the source really hammers this point home. This wasn't just some outside influence. It was something God's own people started doing. We see the prophet Jeremiah recording God calling them out directly for making offerings to this Queen of Heaven.
All right, now we're going to fast forward a few hundred years. The author takes us to the Roman Empire, which they present as this massive, critical turning point in the story. This is where, they argue, that ancient Babylonian system found a new and very powerful place to set up shop.
So this timeline really shows the before and after. For almost 3 centuries, the Christian church was persecuted, right? It was an underground movement. But then everything changes with the Edict of Milan. Christianity becomes legal. And the source argues that Rome's strategy flipped. Instead of trying to stamp it out, they started to absorb it. And this kicked off what's known as syncretism, basically a blending of different beliefs. So what does that blending look like? Well, the author's argument is that paganism didn't really go away. It just got a makeover. The claim is that old pagan festivals were rebranded as Christian holy days. The worship of various gods and goddesses was transformed into the veneration of saints, and, most central to this whole argument, the worship of the Mother Goddess, the Queen of Heaven, was allegedly transferred over to Mary.
And that brings us to the author's final point. This isn't just presented as a history lesson. It's framed as a really direct, urgent message for believers living right now, a call to be aware of all this.
The main takeaway, the big warning the author leaves us with, is that this kind of counterfeit worship is sneaky. It's deceptive. It doesn't show up with horns and a pitchfork, you know? The argument is that it uses familiar language, sacred symbols, things that look and feel right, which makes it really hard to tell apart from the real thing. So the final plea is for people to check their traditions against what the scriptures actually say.
And the author wraps up their entire argument with this quote from the book of Revelation, "Come out of her, my people." In this context, Babylon isn't just some ancient city in the desert. It's presented as a spiritual system that exists today, a system of deception, and this verse is used as a direct call for believers to separate themselves from it.
So here we are, right back where we started, with a question. The author isn't just laying out historical claims. They're ending with a challenge, really. A challenge for each person to look at their own traditions and ask, where do these things really come from? Are they rooted in Scripture, or are they connected to the very systems the Scripture warns us about? It's a heavy question, and the article leaves you to think about what it all means.